They say there are two sides to every story. Consider both before you form an opinion. Easier said than done. Look at the conflict in Ukraine. One side is dominating the global narrative. The other side has been proclaimed the villain. I'm talking about NATO and Russia. And while there's a solid case against Russia here, this story too has another side. And as the tellers of the story, we must dwell on and reflect it. Vladimir Putin's aggression is being called out, and rightly so. Invading a sovereign country cannot be justified. But what led the world to the point of this invasion? Leaders in Moscow say they are the aggrieved party. They are the victims of NATO's eastward march, and they're only acting in self-defense. Here's why. Over the past 25 years, NATO has been creeping closer to the Russian border. Former Soviet states have become NATO members. This military alliance has technically absorbed the entire security belt of Moscow. Russia sees this expansion as a provocation. It hurts their security interests and won't end well for both sides, they said. The warnings were clear. NATO ignored them. Call it their myopia or arrogance. They downplayed Moscow's concerns, kept proceeding with new rounds of expansion until things blew up in Ukraine. Did NATO push Ukraine into this war?
To look at this and say the reason that the Russian army is on NATO, the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is because NATO has expanded rather than the Russians expanding. That, in other words, NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO. Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for...
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army, it's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to move
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern cities.
I'm pretty sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed.
It's not changed, but I'm pretty sure the movement by Russia is Russia's decision.
If NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved.
NATO is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
Unfortunately, for 50 years, it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So do you not understand it? So do you not understand how? Can you not even see how the Russians will perceive it as a threat? And the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border, while their troops, I mean, the places where their troops are, you say their troops are, and may have been in Ukraine and Georgia, are not NATO members.
I'm not going to pretend to know what goes in President Putin's mind or Russian military commanders. I mean, I barely got a history degree at the University of South Florida. Right. What I can tell you is that NATO is a defensive alliance. It remains a defensive alliance.
Fair enough, but it has moved east, correct? I mean, that's just a fact.
It has expanded, absolutely.
Right, exactly.
But there's no reason for anybody to think the expansion is a hostile or threatening move. And we've been saying that throughout the last 15 years, man.
It's like you're moving closer to Russia. You're blaming the Russians for being close to NATO.
No.
Yeah,
That's exactly what Hagel's
We're blaming the Russians for violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine and destabilizing the security
which is
situation
not a
inside
NATO
Europe.
member. Which is not a NATO.
I see
other countries feel threatened.
Nothing makes me happier than when you actually see a really good reporter that has the balls to do stuff like that and isn't silenced because they're scared about losing their job. I love things like that.
Join us. David, if I could start with you. Look, Ukraine was a sovereign nation. It was attacked and invaded illegally by a dictator who rules the end of the Soviet Union. Surely those of us who believe in the rule of law and international stability should be doing everything we can to make sure that Ukraine prevails, shouldn't we?
I don't agree with what you said in your question there. There were some opinions you put in there. And the thing is, with this conflict, it's actually started in 2014. We had the Minsk agreements where there was an agreement between NATO powers and Russia and Ukraine to give Crimea autonomy and to give the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass autonomy as well. But those agreements are broken. And what you have is the Ukrainian regime, the Poroshenko and then the Zelensky regime afterwards, have been bombing and shelling ethnic Russians in the Donbass area for 8 years, with 14,000 people at least being killed. And so I think what's happened there is that Putin has basically gone in what he calls a special military operation in order to try to protect the lives of Russian people in the Donbass, because Western governments in NATO were actively arming the Ukrainian government, which actually is filled with real Nazi battalions like the Azov battalion and the Right Sector and so on. So it's not quite as how you laid out in your question. And the thing is, I think people in this country are completely fed up of it because it's got really nothing to do with the lives of ordinary people in the UK, and are fed up of the government, the power in London.
Thank you.